Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Lil Dudes Insect Academy podcast. I'm super excited to be here with my new friend Sam. Wait, before we get started, I just wanted to say thank you for tuning into this episode of the Lil Dudes Insect Academy podcast, and just ask you to please hit the like button below or click the subscribe button if you're watching on YouTube, or follow this podcast if you are listening. That really helps the show out. But also, if you want to help us further, then join our Patreon. We have an awesome community that is growing there. Or if you want to make a one-time donation, we are a nonprofit foundation. So head to our website. Both the Patreon and the website will be linked down below. But without further ado, back to the episode. Me and Sam met a little bit ago at the Entomological Society of America annual meeting. This year was in Phoenix, and he just told me a little bit about what he was working on, and I was like, oh man, he has to be on the show because you guys all need to hear about this. It's some of the craziest stuff. So welcome to the show, Sam. Thank you so much for coming on the show. So go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit for us.
All right. Thank you for having me.
Mm-hmm.
So, think about all the things that make humanity special compared to other animals. Now think about the fact that insects did all of those things millions of years ago, all the way back to the Jurassic. That's what I study. Specifically, what I work on is ants, and what I work on is their agricultural systems, for lack of a better term. So, before we get too far into that, we should talk about something called trophobiosis.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's a type of mutualism. And basically, what it is when you have a partnership of two organisms where one is providing food in exchange for some sort of benefit, usually protection, maybe housing, stuff like that. Now, ants very commonly engage in these relationships. In fact, when you go outside and you see lines of ants going up and down the trees, more often than not, that's what they're doing. There are aphids up there, or mealybugs, something like that. They're going up, harvesting what's called honeydew, which is actually excretions. Sugar-rich substance, lots of protein. So the ants like that. And in exchange, what they're doing is protecting them from their predators.
Mm-hmm.
Now, most of these relationships are what we call facultative. In other words, it's optional, it's something that neither party actually needs to survive. What I study is what's called obligate trophobiosis. That's the exact opposite, where now we have these two partners, again, that sort of food in exchange for protection thing, but they literally cannot survive without each other. Again, there are quite a few examples of this. So over in Europe, there's what's called the yellow garden ant, Lasius flavus, that does something like this, where they actually maintain clonal lineages of aphids inside their nest that they gather from outside and bring in. Sort of the aphid distribution system, kind of like the cat distribution system. What I work on, though, is a genus of ants called Acropyga. So these are little yellow ants, that's going to be a common theme here, that live in the tropics all around. Although there is actually one species in Arizona. I believe it's Epidana. Acropyga epidana lives in Arizona. Now, the thing that makes them special is they're a lot like Lasius flavus. They maintain herds of what are called mealybugs, so more sap-sucking insects, in their nests. Now, the really wild thing that they do is they have gotten it to a point that it almost borders on domestication. And there's a big slap fight between entomologists and anthropologists about using that word, because the anthropologists say, no, that only applies to human activities. We tell them to pound sand. And yeah. So basically what Acropyga queens do, and I have a picture of it here. Alrighty, awesome. Okay, so what we see here, this is an Acropyga queen. She has just shed her wings. She's got her mate here. And if you look, it's hard to see, but in her mandibles, she actually has a mealybug. So this is a behavior that you can see it a little bit better. This is actually a fossil of one. You can
Yeah.
see the mealybug there. Um, so my PI, the guy I'm working under, calls this behavior trophophoresis. Basically, the idea is that these queens are taking a mealybug from their home colony with them when they go to found a new one.
That's
So you think about what
crazy.
that does, right? That's like wild because
Yeah.
essentially yeah, the queens are choosing which mealybugs get to go on to the new colonies. Every new colony is like a genetic bottleneck,
Right.
we think.
Oh man. Um so just for a little bit of a background, like can you tell us a little bit about what mealy bugs are? I mean, I have some understanding, but like for the folks at home that might not know what they are, can you tell us a little bit more about those?
Yeah, sure. So, mealybugs belong to an order of insects called Hemiptera. These are basically insects with what we call piercing, sucking mouthparts. So, you think of like your stink bugs, cicadas, right? Things
Mm-hmm.
that feed by drilling into usually a plant, although there are exceptions, and sucking out the fluid. Um, they are close relatives of aphids, so you'll often see them actually. If you look on the leaf of some sort of plant and you see little white, almost fluffy looking things, those are actually mealybugs.
Mm.
In fact, those ones are really cool because they're actually sessile, kind of like corals. So they actually glue themselves to the plant and are unable to move.
Yeah,
Not
so they
all of them are like that, but
don't even have legs then, right?
pretty much, yeah. Um, they're actually considered the most destructive agricultural pests in the world by some.
Oh wow. Yeah. Um so mealy bugs would be like, is that a whole family, or like they come in all shapes and sizes and varieties and colors, right?
Yes, so they belong to a suborder called Sternorhyncha, along with the aphids. Those are their closest relatives, and the mealybugs are a family, I believe. Brain farting on this. Yeah, so they are in the family, a family called Pseudococcidae.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I've seen some like really weird looking ones, like got like little spikes coming
Mm-hmm.
off of them, and like are scale insects and mealy bugs like similar, or do you know?
Yeah, scale insects are just another term for mealybugs.
Oh, okay, okay. Yeah, I mean, I've seen some really weird looking ones, but scale insects. So they feed on the like chlorophyll of the plant, is that right?
Yeah, so they basically drill into usually what's called the phloem of the plant. These are little tubes that transport sugars as well as other nutrients for the plant, so like proteins back and forth. There are a couple that feed on the xylem, which are slightly hardier and transport water. But most of your scale insects are going to go for phloem, which I guess makes sense because that's a little more nutritionally valuable than just water with a smidgen of glucose in there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and with these ants, do you see them like, farming like a specific kind of mealybug like per species, or do they kind of like generalist work with them?
So, tentatively, we can definitely say that they tend to be associated with a couple of different families of mealybugs.
Okay.
So, broadly speaking, they're associated with a family called Xenococcidae, which is really weird in and of itself because their morphology is completely different than any other mealybug.
Hmm.
In fact, the later the posterior sections of the abdomen have actually been compressed and then turned upward. It's almost like a little scorpion tail in a
Hmm.
way. That is unique to them, There's a lot of speculation about what that could be. One of the things is that it may cause them to actually superficially resemble ant larvae, which might make the ants pay more attention to them.
Right.
It's kind of like how cats meow at the same frequency of crying babies.
Right. Yeah. Um. Oh, that's interesting. So okay, so they feed on um the xylem of the
Yeah,
plant,
yeah.
and
And these
then
guys are on the roots.
okay, on the roots. Yeah. Okay. And then they excrete like a sugary. It's called honeydew, right?
Yep.
Okay. So wow, that's crazy. So tell us a little bit more about that. Like how does that work, and like what how do the ants like exploit that?
So basically, it's really weird because a lot of the adaptations that we see for mealybugs that are obligate trophobionts of ants, we say, they seem to have a lot of traits that make the honeydew easier to harvest.
Mm-hmm.
So usually mealybugs, I mean, we talked a little bit about sort of the weird structures that they have. These guys do not have that. So they don't produce any wax that we see. The effect of that is that normally what would happen in sort of a free living mealybug is that the honeydew is going to roll right off their back, which is what you want generally. But that's not what happens with these guys. It actually sits and coalesces on them as like a little droplet that the ants can then have easy access to, just come along, slurp it up at their leisure.
Hmm.
Um, that is a lot of evidence for the fact that they do not exist outside of ant nests because from presumably without being cared for by the ants they would quite literally drown in their own waste, which is not a good way to survive.
Right. Yeah, and oh man, that's interesting. Okay, so there's pretty good evidence that they are um they depend on each other.
Yeah.
Um Man, that's interesting. So when you say like they care for them, like they remove the waste, but then
Mhm.
they feed on it. Do they like does the entire colony feed on that? Like the brood, like the baby ants, the queen or queens, like does
Mhm.
the entire colony survive exclusively on the honeydew or
Yeah, as far as we can tell, yes. So there were actually some experiments, preliminary stuff back in 2002, mind you, but basically what they found is that when they would introduce alternative food sources to the colony, so like chopped up insects, things like that, not only would the ants not feed on it, even if they were starved first, they were
Mhm.
actually aggressive to it.
Hmm. Yeah, so like they don't even recognize it as a food source. So
Nope.
so the honeydew is a nutritionally complete like enough for the colony or
Yep, that's what we assume. It could be, and this isn't unheard of, that they are also eating the mealybugs directly. We haven't
mm,
observed that, so we don't really know if that's the case. In fact, that's one of the really frustrating things about working on Acropyga is that they are what we call hypogeic, so they almost never, or never that we've seen, come and forage on the surface. So
mm,
that, which is kind of evidence of this codependence as well, but it also makes them really hard to observe because they hate light.
right. Um so yeah, so tell us about that. Like how do you actually study it? Like do you have captive colonies or do you like I don't like dig them up and like try and observe the best you can or combination of both?
So we don't actually keep captive colonies. The lab I work on is mostly taxonomy. In fact, my research is actually kind of their first foray into population genetics
Hmm.
proper. Um, so usually what we're doing is we are looking at preserved specimens and we're looking at more morphological stuff, right? That implies sort of this relationship that we're thinking. Um, we have attempted to do captive colonies before, but because most of the species we're interested in are not native to the United States, that is a legal nightmare.
Right. Yeah, and you're at Towson. That's in Maryland, right?
Yep.
Yeah, so I think that's a private school, right?
We're I think we're a state university.
Oh, okay. Um, yeah, I mean, I know it's really difficult to get a lot of tropical ants specifically because ants are very, successful invasively. Typically,
Hmm.
like the obviously the fire ant in Florida and the South
Yeah.
is like, a nightmare. So that makes sense because ants are specifically hardy and easy to take over areas. So that makes
Unless
sense
they're not.
because sorry.
Unless they're not. It's actually kind of funny you mentioned fire ants. Sorry, this just popped into my head.
Yeah, go ahead.
They're actually now being outcompeted by other invasive ants from the same area,
Oh,
like the
really?
Argentine ants, the crazy ants they're called. So yeah, the
Yeah.
entire Southwest has just become an ant war zone.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's super super crazy. So, tell us like about your experience with studying this farming behavior and like um what you've kind of discovered and that thing you mentioned about this phenomenon of farming existing for so long. Animals have been doing it for a
Mhm.
long time.
Yeah, so actually the what we think the first insect farmers on Earth actually were actually not ants but termites, which are, a lot of people seem to assume that they're closely related. They're not
Yeah.
at all.
Hmm.
Termites are actually technically roaches,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
wild to me.
Hmm.
But they, and actually a lot of other ants do this too, they actually farmed fungus in kind of the same way,
Yeah.
where queens leaving the nest would take a clump of fungus with them, plant it at their new nest site, and use that to feed their growing brood. Um, and that's kind of the more well studied. Going back to ants, that's kind of what we know more about because we have the attines, we all know and love them, the leaf cutters.
Yeah.
Um, I think a big part of the reason for that is that they do really well in captivity.
Yeah.
They're not afraid of the light at all, so you
Hmm.
can keep a really big colony and just observe. It's really easy to take DNA,
The ants
which
themselves are larger too, so that helps.
exactly, yeah, you can actually see what they're doing.
Hmm.
Um, Now the thing with Acropyga and kind of what I'm doing is looking at DNA sequences from a population in Peru. We were working on a population from Panama, but the Smithsonian is swamped right now, so
Hmm.
I'm not going to have that for my thesis, but that's okay. Um, so basically, we are looking at what we call SNPs or SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
Minute differences in the genome that can kind of tell us a little bit about how these mealybugs are related to each other.
Mm.
Well, yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. So so you're studying like so you're referring to the SNPs in the mealybug genetics.
Yeah. We
Okay.
do want to look a little bit at ant genetics too, but that's kind of secondary to our main goal. Um, Essentially, what we want to kind of find out is basically the family tree of these mealybugs.
Mm.
Because our thought for this domestication argument is that, well, all the mealybugs in the colony are descended from this one mealybug that gets brought over during trophophoresis. This one female goes on to give birth to all of them. And that's kind of our thought that the ants are maybe using that to select for traits that they want, which is exactly what we do with our livestock. Um, so that's kind of what we're looking at. Um, Although it's interesting though because what we're finding is that we kind of assume that they might be reproducing primarily asexually because mealybugs often do that.
Yeah.
What we're finding is that they seem to be reproducing sexually instead, which is not what we expected. We still can't say definitively if they are all descended from that single mealybug. So it could very well be a Game of Thrones type situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so you mentioned mealybugs typically reproduce asexually. Um, so
They
you
can.
think,
It depends.
yeah. So your theory is that, or your hypothesis is that they are like maybe not consciously, right? Because they're ants, but
Yeah.
like they seem to be selectively maybe breeding the mealybugs to get certain traits that are advantageous to them.
Yeah, exactly. Um, and this is
That would
yeah,
be crazy. Yeah.
and
Um,
this yeah.
that I mean that blows my mind because like I don't see how. I mean that seems like a pretty um purposeful like conscious thought process to like what we do with cattle and
Yeah,
really all animals.
it's exactly what we do.
I mean that would be crazy. So I mean they're milking them for their honeydew. They're
Mhm.
possibly selectively breeding them, and they're taking them to start new colonies when they branch off from their founding colony.
Yeah.
That's that's mind blowing to me. So what is like the implications like of this research? Like obviously this is new stuff, but like in the broader sense of things, like what does it mean?
hmm So one of the big questions we often have is the evolution of symbiotic relationships. With mutualism, it's kind of problematic because you kind of inherently expect there to be this tug of war between the partners because you know evolution kind of favors those get who can take the most benefit from the partnership without contributing their own resources to it.
Right.
So, there's actually some examples of this. I can't think of the name of the bee, but there's a species of bee that instead of visiting the flower and actually going through the flower, getting the pollen on it and carrying it,
Mm-hmm.
it goes around the flower and drills through it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's a bombus, a bumblebee. I'm
Yeah.
not
I think you're
sure. I
right.
don't remember what kind, but I'm pretty sure
Yeah,
it's a kind of bumblebee.
I'm not good with
But yeah, they
honeybees.
take they take the nectar reward without actually pollinating the flower, which would be the benefit to the flower.
hmm
Oh man.
So yeah. So you have this tug of war between the symbiotes, and yet we have these examples of mutualism that have lasted for a very long time. I mean, this relationship that Acropyga has with their mealybugs goes back at least 30 million years, if we believe the fossil record,
Mm-hmm.
um, and even longer for the fungus farmers. Right? We have evidence of that going all the way back to the Cretaceous.
Yeah, that's crazy. Um,
Yeah,
so have you done any work with the fungus ants as well, or
I
you
have
kind of studied
not.
both of them?
You so one of the things is that the fungus farmers, because they're so much better understood, that's kind of our frame of reference. So
Yeah.
that's kind of one of the things is kind of comparing and contrasting these two systems, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have one where they're obviously farming a fungus, and then this other one where they're farming a fellow arthropod is, so inherently there's going to be some differences there, and we want to kind of figure out what those are.
Mm-hmm. So I got an interesting, thought for you.
Mhm.
If they are not if, but we see that they are, dependent on each other. Um, so like, do you think that would make them more or less prone to like collapse? Like, since they're working together, do you think they're stronger together? And like, if one of them went extinct for some reason, like the other one would too, or do you think like they could bounce back, or maybe like find a different host
Mhm.
system or something like that?
So we do know that one of the things that happened when Acropyga crossed over from the old world, specifically Africa, to the new world, one of the sort of transitions that we see with that is that they're largely not associated with mealybugs in the family Xenococcidae. They seem to have switched over to a new family called Rhizicidae.
Hmm.
That symbiosis is a lot newer. Um, so that the assumption is that that kind of did happen, where for some
Hmm.
reason ancestral Acropyga lost access to the xenococcids through some means. Um, and so, yeah, we definitely know that partner switching does happen. The other thing, sort of a thought experiment that a former grad student in my lab, as well as one of the members of my committee, have thought of, is this idea that often when you have these Acropyga nests, you'll often have neighboring free living mealybugs kind of side by side.
Mhm.
The thought is that they kind of indirectly benefit from the Acropyga being there by warding off predators, things like that. And it's even possible that the Acropyga might opportunistically take honeydew from them.
Mm.
So, if they do lose their symbiotes through some means, they might not actually be SOL completely. They could potentially go for these free living species. And that might be how they ended up with the Rhizicids in the first place.
Mm. Wow, that's crazy. I mean, I think it could go either way, though. I mean, obviously, if they lose their mealybugs, I think it might be more likely that they just go extinct. Maybe it was just like an opportunity that happened to be there, right? But if there's
Yeah.
not really um, a native mealybug that'd be suitable for them, they might just go extinct anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's probably going to be one of the big things that stabilizes these mutualisms is there's not as much opportunity for the partners to betray each other because you can only cheat so much without dooming yourself too.
Yeah, that was actually a question I had for you. Do you see it to be pretty equal as far as benefit to cost between um the mealybugs and the acropyga, or do you see any like cheating? It's called for those of you guys at home, it's called cheating when um or we kind of call it cheating. I don't know that it's a scientific term, but we kind of refer to it as cheating when one party in a relationship somehow benefits either more or the other party benefits less than the other in a relationship, or maybe one is
Mm.
hurting in some way the other party without that one knowing. Do you see any of that happening, or is it like pretty equal between them?
It's hard to say. In terms of the benefit, I would say it's more or less equal, although if what we think about trophophorese is true, then the Acropyga definitely have the upper hand in terms of control of the relationship.
Right. Yeah.
And that we think is a factor that stabilizes these mutualisms and stops the cheating. In fact, we actually see that with the fungus farmers. So they have a lineage of fungus that they've maintained for however long. It's in their best interest to retain those traits, and the way to do that is by stopping the fungus from sexually reproducing. So when their fungus
Mm.
produces fruiting bodies to release spores, the ants actually will start to release alarm signals. So the whole colony just freaks out and starts destroying them.
Hmm.
So yeah, so definitely thinking about control by one partner, and this is kind of where we get the idea of, using the D word, domestication, from, is that we have this element of control.
Mm.
And that seems to be what holds a lot of these relationships together.
Hmm. Yeah. And I mean, okay, so I don't really know too much about them. But to me, at least from the outside, just from what you've been telling me, it seems like maybe the mealybugs um, could maybe live on their own, or was it the waste removal thing that you mentioned? Is that kind of what keeps them, um, from surviving? Or
Partially. The other part of it is that mealybugs, often when you look at them, especially under a microscope, you'll see all these weird little tube-like structures. Those are defensive structures. So often that's what's called an ostiole. Basically, what it is a little tube that sprays hemolymph or blood at approaching predators to kind of deter them,
mm,
sort of like those lizards out in the Southwest. Um, and the mealybugs that we see with Acropyga have lost that.
mm,
So, kind of the deduction there, I guess, is that they're helpless against predators, and their waste products literally just coalesce on top of them.
mm.
So, based on that, we can kind of assume that they cannot live on their own, although they could potentially. We don't quite know.
Yeah, and your thought about the ants selectively breeding for certain traits in the mealybugs definitely would stand up in that case because those defensive structures would obviously not be good for the ants. Um, so I mean that would be crazy, if they selectively breed, against the defensive traits and for the uh, honeydew producing traits. I mean, it's like a dairy cow in that case. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, there's a reason all of our livestock are so docile.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, especially compared to their like wild counterparts, like domesticated cats and dogs, especially.
Hmm.
I mean, the difference is obviously that relationship is even shorter than this, significantly shorter than this mealybug and ant relationship. I mean, that's super interesting to think about, like how different cats and dogs have become um, through our selectively breed, and obviously humans have. I would say, not I would say, humans obviously have a more conscious thought process when they're selectively breeding for
Yeah.
and against certain things in cats and dogs. But um, I mean, that's still just a really interesting thing to think about. So something that kind of caught my eye when you were talking about them taking a single female to start a new colony. Um, that's really interesting to me. Tell us a little bit more about that. Like, how did they like start a new colony just from that, and like, how do you deal with the issues of genetics and inbreeding and like that kind of stuff with those mealybugs?
Um, that is definitely an open question. So,
Mm-hmm.
often in these kind of systems where you have very inbred individuals, that leads to what's called inbreeding depression, where essentially, when you're inbred, all these negative mutations start to happen, they build up, and there's really no way out because without access to more distantly related individuals, um, there's nothing to mask those traits.
Yeah.
Um, right, you think of Egypt with the Ptolemaic dynasty or the Habsburgs.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, that's the reason we have republics.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, to get at that question a little bit though, it's definitely interesting because while we expect the farmers, if you will, in these relationships to favor asexual reproduction, you can't have that exclusively because you're right. And so there's a couple of avenues that they might be able to introduce more genetic diversity to the colony. So, oftentimes these Acropyga nests are very densely clustered around root systems. And as a consequence of that, the mealybugs might have an opportunity to escape. So, newborn mealybugs, what we call first instar mealybugs, we call those crawlers because they're very, very mobile, much more than the adults. So it's entirely possible that crawlers from one colony might be able to hop the fence, and especially if they're male, but even if they're female, that leads to opportunities for outbreeding. The other kind of more entertaining possibility is that ants are actively cattle rustling. So it's entirely possible that neighboring colonies might be stealing their rivals' mealybugs, which, ants in nature will kind of do that anyway. Most colonies will adopt larvae of the same species if they're given the opportunity, which makes sense, free workers essentially. So it's entirely possible that this cattle rustling, if it is happening, we don't know, could have evolved as kind of an extension of that. Especially because the mealybugs, we talked about this a little bit already, but superficially look like ant larvae. They're housed in the same chambers as the larvae. So it's really easy to imagine a couple of them just getting snatched up by a rival occasionally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so for that to happen though, a rival ant needs to essentially sneak into the colony chamber though, because that's where the mealybugs are, right?
Yeah.
So that's interesting. Do you see like I don't know. I guess this is like a third party though. I don't know. I'm just thinking about this. Like the plant, is there like a plant, um, like a is there a plant preference in like the mealybugs or like where the ants seem to nest, or do they know like what the mealybugs like as far as plant host?
Um, we think that the mealybugs are pretty polyphagous. In other words, they'll take what they can get.
Yeah.
That said, though, this is purely anecdotal, so take it with many, many grains of salt. Um, one of the best places to find them is actually on coffee plantations.
Hmm.
In fact, one of the species of rhizicids that they're associated with commonly is literally called Rhizicus coffeae for that reason.
Mm.
We don't know. It's hard to say how actually agriculturally significant they are, just because we haven't studied it.
Right.
But yeah, yeah. It's often my PI will tell you that we often find them on around tree buttresses, although that could easily be sampling bias because that's where he knows where to find them.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and in general, I just from thinking about it, like I'm sure it's pretty hard to find nests other than like, oh, I know that they like this area, or I know that
Yeah.
they like coffee coffee plantations or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I could totally see how that is, yeah, sampling bias because you're like, I'm just gonna try and find them where I know to find them, right? It's as simple as that.
Yeah. Right. 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 We don't have the time or money to go digging up the entire forest.
Right? Yeah. Um. Oh man, this is so cool. Do you see? I don't know. I know you're like, this is an ongoing thing, so I'm
Mhm.
asking lots of questions that
No, you're
we
good.
just
You're good.
don't know the answers to yet. But this is just so cool to me. So you're doing like lots of genetic studies with the mealybugs. Um, to do that, do you like collect mealybugs like from the nest, or
Yep.
like breed them separately? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, so the ones I'm working with were collected from Peru, although we do also have this other set from Panama. Um, they're typically, we euthanize them with ethanol and sort of preserve them,
Hmm.
keeping track of which colonies they came from. And then what we do is basically what we take a little pin like you would to mount an insect. You poke it in the side, and then you extract your DNA from it. What that leaves you with is two things. First of all, DNA, and second of all, sort of the empty exoskeleton that you can then make a slide mount of to kind of refer back to later.
Okay.
Yeah, in fact, we actually, while doing that, we sort of accidentally found two new species belonging to the genus Rhiperziella.
Mm.
So if
Oh,
you want
that's
one
cool.
named after you, I'll give you my Venmo.
Yeah. Oh, that's cool though. Oh man. So you found, you said two new species?
Yep.
So those were like only found in like a very small, I'm sure we don't know a lot about them yet, but like they're
Yeah.
on, as far as you know, like they're only found in like these colonies, or maybe a region with these colonies, right?
As far as we know, we it's kind of funny because of the two species we have, only one of them was actually found in multiple colonies. Both were actually found with the same Acropyga species,
Mm.
Acropyga exsanguis. Um, so that's kind of interesting. The It's always really challenging to establish ranges for these guys
Yeah.
because we don't know if they're there because that's where we're looking for them, or we just haven't found them in other places. So that's kind of an ongoing thing. So far, all we can really say is that these guys are found with Acropyga exsanguis on Barro Colorado Island, which is in Panama.
Yeah. Oh man, that's crazy. So there's like, kind of a basic evolutionary principle is that when something is separated from another population, speciation can occur.
Hmm.
Um, and that's what the ants are literally doing manually all the time.
Yep.
So it's
Every
like,
colony is an island, essentially.
yeah, so it's like pretty safe to guess that maybe this might be that. Like they were separated by a queen to start a new colony, and speciation occurred after that.
Yeah, that is more or less what we think. There's actually a researcher, Bonnie Blamer, in Germany, who is currently working on a project to sort of tease that apart. We've had several attempts to do that with varying degrees of success, but
Hmm.
that is something we are hoping to kind of pin down.
Man, that's crazy. Yeah, I mean, this is mind blowing to me. I'm, I really like ants. It's kind of what I'm thinking about doing my research on. So,
Mhm.
um, this is like right up my alley. So, really, really cool stuff. But, um, Sam, let's talk a little bit about like you and where you are. So, um, you're doing this research at Towson,
Yep.
and are you in your grad program, master's?
Yes, I'm actually, um, God help me, but I'm rapidly approaching my final semester there, so we should have this all wrapped up. God, I hope so. Um, and yeah, I'm doing this as part of my master's thesis. This is tail end of my third year.
Nice. Um, oh, that's awesome. Yeah. So, um, are you like thinking of doing like anything after that? Like, well, not like obviously you're thinking about
Right.
doing
Yeah, yeah,
things
yeah.
after that, but like PhD, or maybe are you thinking with Towson, or do they have PhD?
So they actually don't have a PhD
Oh, okay.
program, so I'd have to go elsewhere for that. In terms of the PhD itself, I'm definitely interested in doing that, although I'm gonna take my time making that decision.
Yeah.
You know, um, I, I I think a lot of people go into grad school with the assumption that they literally can't do anything else, and that's just not true.
Yeah.
And it's really sad that people fall into that trap.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So so a little bit like about your schooling career. What did you do for your bachelor's degree?
Okay, so this is a fun one.
Yeah.
So I actually did do my bachelor's at Towson. I actually started as a psych major. I wanted to be a therapist.
Oh wow.
And then I realized that being a therapist absolutely sucks.
Yeah. Compared to
Now,
bugs, I mean,
yeah, exactly.
yeah.
It's sort of more or less complicated. Um, so basically, I kind of realized this going into my junior year. I was like, oh
Oh
wow, I
wow.
don't, I don't actually want to be a psych major. But it worked out well for me because Towson has an animal behavior major. It's what
Hmm.
they call interdisciplinary studies, which for them basically means that they took a bunch of psychology courses and a bunch of biology courses and smushed them together into this horrible amalgamation.
Yeah.
So I was able to double major in that and, still
Oh,
managed to get
okay.
out in 4 years.
Okay.
And
So you
yeah,
finished. Wow. So you still got out in 4 years. That's crazy. So you graduated with a double major
yep,
then in psychology and animal sciences. Is that right?
animal behavior. But yeah, um,
Wow.
I also took a minor in bio,
Yeah.
but yeah, I was able to
Um.
kind of double dip that and make it work out.
Yeah. So um, does Towson have like formal entomology, or do they just work with entomology a lot? Like, What's your master's like in animal behavior?
Technically biology.
Okay.
That said, they do a lot of entomological stuff. So my PI is John Lapola, who works primarily on Acropyga, but
Cool.
he also works on another genus, Nylandaria. So he's kind of our ant guy. We have Mark Bulmer there as well, who works on termites.
Mm.
His research is actually pretty cool. He works on basically how colonies respond to disease, because
Mm.
that's kind of a major factor when you live in a big group. We kind of
Hmm.
saw this with COVID. Is how do you handle disease outbreaks when you're literally packed into your nest like sardines?
And sorry, I'm just building off of that. And
Yeah, no,
especially when everybody is so closely related, because termites have such high relatedness within the colony.
yeah,
That could be a really big issue if a disease breaks out. That's why, genetic diversity is so important in a population, and asexual reproduction is often detrimental. Is because if a disease comes through, you all have almost identical genetics, so it's just going to wipe all of
hmm
you out, right?
and as an invertebrate, you don't have adaptive immunity like us, where you can make antibodies.
Right.
You have
Yeah.
specific immunity where you can fight off certain infections really well, but if something comes along that you're not adapted to, you're done,
Yeah.
basically.
Oh, that's cool.
Although, yeah, although recently, I want to say it was a Lasius species of ant that actually does have adaptive immunity.
Hmm. That's
Yeah, they
weird.
have little antibodies.
No way. So that's like separately from the little insects have um, these things called hemocytes um, that
I
like
was
attack um, internal invaders into the insect. Um, yeah, that's crazy. And that's completely different from antibodies that humans have.
I was actually
Um,
just making a pun about antibodies. I'm sorry.
oh, that's good.
But none of that is true.
Oh, oh man. Um,
I'm sorry.
antibodies. That's awesome. Um, oh man, that's awesome. Yeah. So Towson does lots of work in entomology.
Yeah, we also, if you ever meet, in fact, you probably will as an entomologist, Lohit Garikipati.
Yeah.
Is he was at our program. He defended recently, but
Hmm.
he works on praying mantises.
Yeah.
In fact, I
He's
think
been
he's
a
on
guest.
Instagram.
He's been a
Oh,
guest
he
on the show
has.
before. Yeah.
He has. Yeah.
Hmm.
Okay, then you know him well.
Yeah, that was my that was kind of my frame of reference with Towson. So I knew that he
Yeah.
was there and he was doing mantises. And then I saw that you went to or are going to Towson right now, and I was like, oh, okay, they must, they must like bugs
Yeah.
to some extent, right?
Yeah, we
It's really
do.
cool.
At least in my lab, we do actually have a pretty close relationship with UFL as well, and
Nice.
they
Yeah.
they they are particularly good, from what I understand.
Yeah. I mean, I'm obviously biased because I'm here, but yeah, um, yeah, we've got lots of cool stuff going on. Oh man, that's awesome. So you've enjoyed your time at Towson so far. Obviously, if you've gotten to, well, it'll actually be 3 degrees,
God,
from there.
it's
But like, are
horrible.
you like pretty, um, like focused on these ants? Like, this is what you want to do forever, or do you kind of just want to study this, um, insect, agriculture behavior in general? Like, or are you like interested in something else that we haven't talked about yet?
I'm generally speaking, I'm broadly interested in just insect societies in general,
Mm,
right? Sort of looking at how they have a lot of the same problems we do, right? Inbred livestock, disease, conflict both within and outside of the nest,
hmm.
and kind of looking at how they handle that. I mean, I kind of wonder if it can't teach us something about how we handle those problems.
Yeah, yeah, that's pretty cool. Yeah, I mean, there's certainly certain things. I mean, ants are like some of the most efficient, and most
Hmm.
social insects in general are some of the most. Um, Eusocial insects specifically are like
Right,
some of the most efficient and well working organisms I've ever seen. I mean, they work together. They all have unique jobs and like communicate so well. And part of that might be because they're um, relatives. But I don't know. With humans, sometimes that's even worse if you're relatives. So, um, yeah. Um, that's really cool. Yeah. So, um, you're interested in like insect societies in general.
yeah, there was. You may or may not be privy to this. Jonathan Pruitt. It
Yeah,
was a whole
I've
thing.
heard.
Where, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
biological dystopias. I'm kind of. I mean, I know his name sketches people out, and rightfully so. But I am actually kind of interested in that sort of area. Right? You have
Mm-hmm.
these insect societies that are ultimately doomed to fail, one way or another. How do they continue to exist, and sort of how do they make the most of the time that they have, right?
Right. Yeah, because most social insects, the workers that is, don't live very long, right? So they
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 don't.
like um they need to be as efficient as possible while like preserving um their bodies so that they can live as long as they can. For most of them,
Yeah,
it's like a couple months, right? Um,
generally. In fact, if it's really busy, they will quite literally work themselves to death a lot of the times. We see that in
Yeah.
honeybees.
Yeah.
Mortality is much higher in the summer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then during the winter, their metabolism slows down, and they're not going
Yeah,
out as much, and so, um, most of that's interesting to think about though. Like the job of a worker is completely different depending on the time of the year because at least if you're in a temperate environment, you've got the winter, and your job is to slow down and like use as little resources as possible, stuff like
yeah,
that. Um, it's interesting to think about for
yeah.
sure.
And so it's interesting, kind of the also how they kind of shuffle their labor around, because there's a statistic out there. I think it's like 30% of ants in a colony do no work.
Hmm.
What that probably is it's kind of like a reserve. So they're kind of like shuffling workers to ensure that they don't necessarily get overworked to that extent.
Hmm.
So that they have basically it's basically just PTO.
Yeah.
It's kind of yeah,
And like in case there's like an invader or for some reason a bunch of workers die or
yeah, yeah,
predation happens. Um, yeah, it's certainly interesting to think about. And I've been learning a lot about social insects recently because it's kind of my interest.
hmm
And some of the things they do for disease and stuff is really cool too. Do you see like any of that in the mealybugs, like a disease that goes through, or obviously, like I said earlier, this is obviously all still very
yeah,
um, experimental. We don't actually know a whole lot, but
yeah,
do you know anything
and
about that?
so we don't, and that in itself may be meaningful. It could be
Yeah.
that the ants are doing such a good job of keeping them protected and disease free that it's basically non-existent. I mean, we
Mm.
kind of see that in leafcutter ants where the workers will produce these antimicrobial secretions that kills off anything in the colony that's not their fungus that they're growing.
Hmm.
Um, so it could be a similar thing, although that is kind of a question that we have, right? Is we have this system, Acropyga are everywhere. So where are the predators? Where are the parasites? Where is the disease? That's kind of an open question that we have, and we don't have a good answer to it.
Yeah, I mean that could be a really good reason why um, the answer there is to protect them against parasites and um,
Yeah.
possibly even disease.
Yeah, especially
Like that's a
because
job of a human farmer. So
yeah.
right.
And as the mealybugs are now, they have no protection because with free living mealybugs, they produce that wax, and that's essentially a barrier, right? Some parasitoid wasp is going to have a much harder time drilling into that mealybug with that wax
Mm.
there, and you know these mealybugs are just kind of walking around without it.
Hmm.
So yeah, I mean, definitely disease control is probably one of the big benefits that the ants are providing.
Mm-hmm. Um. Oh man, yeah. I mean, this has been so cool. So like looking forward to the future. Do you have any like big plans after graduation or like trips you want to go on? Anything like that you want to talk about?
I'm gonna go to bed for about 6 months.
Yeah, yeah, that's fair. Um, yeah, that's fair for sure. I mean, lots of hard work and writing, and oh my goodness. Yeah, anything you're looking forward to, like, um, projects you want to do or trips you want to go on, anything like that?
Honestly, I mostly just look forward to not necessarily doing those things, but having the freedom to do them, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, and that's, for people watching this at home thinking about grad school, that is something you're going to have to consider is that it basically puts your life on hold,
Hmm.
and you'll have to decide if you're okay with that, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh man, yeah, that's awesome. So not sure about like a PhD yet. You're not sure yet, and it would have to be somewhere else. So I guess that's a
Yeah.
big choice as well.
Yeah, I definitely would like to just work for a little bit.
Hmm. Um, are you originally from Maryland or somewhere else?
So yes and no. I was born in Oklahoma, which I don't recommend doing if you can help it.
Yeah.
Um, it's really funny. I have people ask me, and by people I mean one guy at the conference,
Hmm.
ask me, so like, I'm in Oklahoma for my for grad school. What are
Yeah.
some good things to do? And I basically just had to be like, yeah, well, if you keep going south, you'll hit Texas eventually. That's kind of fun.
Basically,
Yeah,
a
no,
fun thing to do is leave. Is what you're saying.
exactly.
Yeah. No hate to Oklahoma if you're listening and you're from Oklahoma, but but also
I have hate for
why?
Oklahoma.
Sorry.
I was just gonna say, I have hate for Oklahoma, but,
All right, yeah. um,
but, but,
oh, that's
but
funny.
yeah,
Yeah, so
uh,
originally born in Oklahoma.
yeah. My family moved up here when I was about 4, though. So for all intents and purposes, I am culturally a Marylander, if not by birth.
Nice, nice. Oh, that's cool. Well, yeah, cool things to look forward to, for
Yeah.
sure. And I mean, your research is like super cool. And then when you were talking to me at ESA, I was like, oh man, this guy has to be on the podcast because this is super cool. And to think that these ants are like farming like miniature cows is,
Yeah.
I mean, if you were to like put a camera on an ant, right? I mean, it would look like
Hmm.
something out of Star Wars, right? I mean, that's just like the
Yeah.
craziest thing
I mean, it's a literal
to
ant
think about.
farm.
Sorry.
It's a literal ant farm.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the levels that this goes through, is crazy to think about. Um, yeah. I mean, it's super cool. But about you a little bit. What else do you enjoy, like other than bugs? Like, do you have any other hobbies or interests
Uh,
that you enjoy?
so I do play guitar. I haven't actually played since COVID.
Hmm.
Um, I was at one point part of a band that played around the Baltimore area.
Oh, that's cool.
We were Please don't look us up. We were not very good.
Yeah.
But
Um,
it was fun,
Mostly acoustic or electric or both?
Electric. We were sort of a quasi metal type thing.
Oh, that's cool. How long you been doing that for?
Um, Started my freshman year of high school, so I guess in theory I've been playing about 9 years.
Hmm.
In practice, probably more like 2.
Yeah, that's cool. Um, how about like movies or video games or anything like that? Do you enjoy any of that? Pop
Yeah,
culture?
I've been playing an unhealthy amount of Dwarf Fortress recently.
Oh yeah, I don't think I've heard of that one. Is
It's
that PC or you mostly a
it,
PC
it
gamer?
it's a PC game. Yeah, yeah. Basically it actually started in like the early 2000s. These two guys, Zach and Tarn, one of which at one point was doing a postdoc in mathematics.
Hmm.
Basically, it is a procedurally generated fantasy world
Hmm.
that is simulated in an agonizing amount of detail, which
That's
makes
cool.
the game prohibitively hard, which is part
Hmm.
of the fun.
That's cool.
There's there's
So,
actually yeah, yeah.
some more of it like a strategy game.
Basically, you're managing a colony of dwarves and helping them survive. Um, there was a bug that would happen a while back where the cats in your fortress would wander through a tavern, dwarves would spill alcohol on them, and then when the cats would go to groom themselves, they'd end up dying of alcohol poisoning.
Oh my
They recently
gosh.
patched that out though.
That was a bug in the game?
Uh,
Like a
yeah,
glitch?
based on the way it calculates fluids and the way in which the cats are bathing themselves.
What? That's crazy. Um, oh man, that's funny. And managing a colony of dwarves, and then you go to work and you manage colonies of ants. um,
I'm
sounds
a
like you've
very
got
one-dimensional person.
sounds like you've got an interest here. Oh, that's
I
funny.
guess
Maybe
so.
you could run for president. No, I'm kidding. Um, um, oh, that's cool. Uh, all right, yeah. So you mentioned like thinking about getting a job after school. Do you have like any idea? Obviously, like don't don't spill like big big
Yeah, yeah.
NDA stuff here, but like what's like your thought around that? Like
Um,
a career you'd like to do?
so there is a lot of stuff out there for bioinformatics, which
Yeah.
I'm kind of interested in. It's really funny because I hated math, throughout my entire education essentially.
Right. I'm the same
But
way.
now that I'm yeah, but now that I'm doing it on my terms, it's like, oh, this is actually kind of cool.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's funny how that works. But yeah, bioinformatics type stuff, especially as it pertains to genetics.
I was about to say
Yeah,
your work with genetics definitely lends itself to bioinformatics. And for those of you at home, bioinformatics is like a fairly new field that's rapidly growing, and it's basically the way that scientists are quantifying a lot of data nowadays. So it's kind of a combination of science and coding.
yeah,
So we use
science.
computers.
Yeah,
Yeah, so we use computers to easily quantify and go through large data sets for scientific purposes.
yeah,
So it's used a lot in genetics as well.
and
Um,
a healthy dose of statistics, or unhealthy, depending on your perspective.
yeah, yeah, but lots of math, coding, and science is sort of conjoined into this large field that is happening now. Really, really exciting and cool field too. And it's funny you mentioned um, not enjoyed math, and now you're like possibly going into it because um, I've never been like a huge chemistry guy. Like I did all right in my general chemistry courses, but
Yeah, yeah,
like it was never my strength as a student. Um, but I was thinking about it recently, and I was like, man, ants are chemistry. Like
oh, absolutely.
they are miniature, like like miniature chemists. Like they use chemical warfare. They use chemistry to communicate with each other. Like if you're studying
Yeah,
ants, you're studying chemistry. Like a lot of the time. So that's just
and
funny to think about. Go ahead.
it's wild. It's funny you bring that up because Ed Wilson, who's
Hmm.
kind of considered the father of myrmecology,
Yeah.
back in his day, he did this experiment with, I think it was weaver ants, looking at how they respond to predators and basically keeping track of what chemicals they emit. And what he actually found was that there's basically like a syntax to it, right? So it is quite literally a language, right?
Mm.
There is a chemical that means there is a predator here. There's another chemical instructing workers to approach the predator, and then a third one that instructs them to attack the predator. All that stuff. I mean, it it is basically a language.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also funny because in honeybees, they've done experiments where they mix European and Asian honeybees. They have similar thing, right? Chemical sort of language, I guess you could call it. What they found is that over time, the workers from different colonies would actually start being able to understand each other's chemical cues.
Mm.
So the colony becomes bilingual.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's interesting to think about. And, I just, in the fall, I took my introductory general entomology course. And we were learning about pheromones and allelochemicals,
Yeah.
which a lot of insects use to communicate with each other, attract mates. They're used a lot in social insects for all of the tasks. Um, but it's interesting to think about because oftentimes there are certain pheromones or chemicals that they put out that to the human nose smell like another thing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of interesting to think about. Like one of the examples my instructor used was um, stink bugs. A lot of people smell like cilantro because they use like um, a similar compound.
Yeah.
There's one in honeybees that smells like, I think it's the queen pheromone. It smells like bananas, right?
I think that's an alarm pheromone.
Yeah.
That's my
Oh yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So like if you're a beekeeper and you break open the hive, they're gonna put the alarm pheromone out. It smells like bananas. It's super weird.
Yeah. So if you're ever near a beehive for people at home, try not to eat bananas around them because
Oh
they will
yeah,
go
that's it.
bananas.
Yeah, because I might have said it smells similar, but it actually is the same, one of the same chemicals that is in those kinds of things, and that's why it
Yeah,
smells like that thing, is because that
it is
chemical
that thing.
is in that thing. Um, so yeah, there's that weird um, phenomenon where some people think cilantro smells like soap or tastes like soap, um, and it's actually an allele that is in our population. So some people think that cilantro tastes like soap, and so it's disgusting. Um, and
Yeah.
so stink bugs smell and taste like cilantro, and they're in soap for some people. So it's an interesting thing. Um, but yeah, toxicology is a whole other thing. Um, all right. Yeah, I mean, I think we covered everything. Is there anything else you wanted to say to the people before we close up?
I I don't know that I have anything.
Yeah. I just like to say thank you so much for coming on the show. This was
Yeah.
super cool and obviously right up my alley. So I like talking
Thank you
about
for having me.
bugs.
This was a lot of
Yeah.
fun.
Yeah. Thanks for taking your time and thank you guys for listening. This was super fun, Sam. So thank you so much. Thank you so much again for coming on the show. This was super fun.
Thank you.